In a climate-controlled vault in Washington, D.C. sits a plain grey box. Inside isn't gold. It isn't state secrets. It's something far more fragile. Inside are the voices of 2,300 people, born in the 1840s, recorded just months before they died. This is the story of the Federal Writers Project, and how a Great Depression experiment saved the true voice of American history. The box is real, acid-free, archival, stored within the collections of the Library of Congress, alongside millions of other documents that most people will never read, never search for, never know exist. Inside that box, and dozens like it, are handwritten transcripts, typed pages with corrected margins, notes in pencil, interviews conducted by government employees during one of the strangest chapters in American federal history. In the 1930s, the Depression, a country trying to survive itself. And the people being interviewed? They were old, very old, born before the Civil War ended, some born before it began. Here is something worth stopping on before we go further. If these interviews hadn't happened, if this specific project hadn't launched in this specific 2-year window, our understanding of American slavery would be fundamentally different today. The first-hand testimony of people who lived it, who remembered it from the inside, who could describe not just what happened, but what it felt like to wake up inside that system, almost none of it would exist in their own words. We would be left with the records kept by the people who owned them. Think about what that means. The Federal Writers Project didn't just preserve history. In some cases, it created the only version of history that was ever told from the ground up. In 1935, the Roosevelt administration created something called the Federal Writers Project. It was part of the Works Progress Administration, a jobs program, technically. But to understand why it existed, you have to understand how desperate the country had become. Imagine the government paying you to write poetry, because there are no other jobs left. Imagine being a trained journalist, a published novelist, a working playwright, and finding yourself unable to afford rent, unable to feed your family, standing in a relief line, with your notebook still in your coat pocket, wondering what any of it was worth now. That was the reality for thousands of American writers in the early 1930s. The Depression had not spared them, but it had not spared anyone. So the government made a decision that was, by any historical standard, radical. It would put writers to work as writers, not in factories, not on road crews. It would pay them to do the one thing they actually knew how to do: observe, listen, and write it down. They fanned out across 48 states, and they listened. By the time the project wound down in the early 1940s, they had conducted somewhere in the range of 2,900 interviews with formerly enslaved people alone. That number doesn't include the broader oral histories, the ethnic community portraits, the regional narratives, the folklore collections, thousands of conversations, thousands of lives, many of them nearly lost. Think about the arithmetic for a moment. But someone born in 1842 would have been 95 years old in 1937, still alive, still lucid, in some cases, still sitting in a chair on a porch in Georgia or Ohio or Louisiana, with a lifetime of American history behind them that no textbook had ever thought to ask about. A person born in 1848 would have been a toddler during the Mexican-American War, a teenager when the country began tearing itself apart over slavery, a young adult when the guns finally went quiet at Appomattox, middle-aged when the continent was stitched together by rail and wire and ambition. They would have grown up inside all of it. And in 1937, they were still here, sitting in chairs, remembering. That is not a small thing. That is an extraordinary thing. But before we talk about who they were and what they remembered, we need to understand what the world around them had already destroyed. Because the story of these interviews is also the story of what almost didn't survive. Start with October 8, 1871. 2 disasters, same night. Most people know the Chicago fire, the story of a city made of wood, burning to its foundation. Over 300 people dead. Roughly 17,000 structures gone, a business district reduced to ash, in under 30 hours. Fewer people know what was happening the same night, 200 miles north. The Peshtigo fire, Wisconsin, a lumber town and the forests surrounding it. The fire moved faster than people could run. It jumped rivers. It created its own weather system, a fire tornado by some accounts that witnesses described as a roaring column, reaching toward the sky. Over 1,000 people died. Some estimates go higher. The exact number was never confirmed, because the record keepers died too. Documents burned, registries burned, family Bibles burned, the paper evidence of entire communities gone, not destroyed carelessly, not destroyed maliciously, just gone because paper burns. That is important to hold on to. 19 years later, 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau completed what was supposed to be a landmark survey of the American population. New questions, new methodologies, new categories designed to capture a country in rapid transformation. Historians have called the 1890 census one of the most ambitious population surveys of the 19th century. In January of 1921, a fire broke out in the Commerce Department building in Washington. The 1890 census records were stored there. The fire, combined with water damage from the firefighting effort, destroyed the overwhelming majority of those records. Congress, facing the cost of restoration, ordered the remaining damaged fragments disposed of in 1933. An entire decade of American life, names, addresses, occupations, family structures, largely gone. Researchers today call it one of the most significant archival losses in American history. Genealogists still work around the gap it creates. The 1880 census, the 1900 census, and in between, silence. Not one fire, two fires, a decade apart, on opposite sides of the country, not a conspiracy. A reminder. Records are not permanent. Archives are not invincible. The past is only preserved when someone decides to preserve it, and sometimes not even then. The children who survived 1871, the ones old enough to remember the orange sky, the smell, the noise, would have been in their 60s and 70s by the time the Federal Writers Project interviewers came knocking. They weren't always the subjects of those interviews. Sometimes they were the neighbours, the grandparents in the background, the ones who said, when the interviewer arrived, that they remembered when all of this looked different. And there were other disruptions, other dislocations. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 200,000 children, many of them orphaned, some of them not, were placed on trains and sent westward from the cities of the East Coast to rural families across the Midwest and Great Plains. The Orphan Train movement, organised primarily by Charles Loring Brace and the Children's Aid Society. It was the largest child migration program in American history. Children were placed on platforms. Farmers and townspeople walked the line and chose. Some children found families. Some found labour arrangements that were indistinguishable from servitude. Some lost their original names, lost their siblings, lost any paper trail connecting them to where they'd come from. A child placed on an orphan train in 1860 would have been in her 70s during the Depression, old enough to have buried that history, old enough to have stopped explaining it, or old enough, finally, to start. Pause on that for a moment, because this is something that gets lost in how we talk about history. We think of the past as something that happened, and then ended. We think of the 1840s as the 1840s, sealed off, completed, filed away. But the people who lived through the 1840s were still alive in the 1930s. They were sitting in those chairs. The woman who remembered the world's Columbian Exposition, Chicago, 1893. The White City, the alabaster buildings along the lakeshore, the electric lights, which many visitors had never seen used outdoors before. The crowds, the strangeness of it, America showing itself to itself, performing its own confidence at a moment when that confidence was already beginning to fray. She was maybe 40 years old when she saw it, maybe 45. In 1937, she was in her 80s. She was still there, if anyone asked. Here is what the Federal Writers' Project interviewers understood, and even if they didn't always articulate it clearly, they were working against time, not deadline time, biological time. The people they were interviewing were not going to be available indefinitely. Every year that passed without an interview was a year that a voice went unrecorded, a face became a faded photograph, a memory became no memory at all. So they went, unemployed writers, armed with nothing but pencils and thick government notepads. They drove down unpaved roads in borrowed cars. They climbed steps to apartments in northern cities where the hallways smelled of coal smoke and old wood. They sat on creaking porches in the humid south, where the air was thick and still, and the sound of chickens in the yard drifted under the conversation like background music. They watched 90-year-old eyes go distant. Bull. They watched something shift behind those eyes, a person travelling backward through time, pulling something up from a depth that hadn't been touched in decades. And they wrote it down, imperfectly, hurriedly, sometimes brilliantly, always impermanently, until someone decided to preserve what they'd collected. The interviewers were not historians. They were writers on relief, skilled, sometimes inspired, often undertrained for the specific work of oral history. The methods were inconsistent. Some interviews are meticulous, some are thin, some capture dialect and cadence with extraordinary fidelity. Others smooth everything into a kind of editorial neutral that strips the voice out entirely. What the person actually said and what got written down, those are not always the same thing. That gap is worth sitting with. The interviews that survived are remarkable for reasons that go beyond their content. They survived at all. After the Federal Writers' Project ended, the materials were dispersed. Some went to the Library of Congress. Some went to state libraries and archives. Some were lost in office closures. Some were simply never typed up from their original handwritten notes. The handwritten notes that then sat in filing cabinets for decades, in buildings that were renovated, relocated, or closed. Historian Gerald Hirsch and others have spent careers reconstructing what the project collected and what it didn't. The picture that emerges is of an enormous, imperfect, occasionally inspired effort to record American life, underfunded, politically complicated. They're staffed by people who were themselves struggling to survive the Depression. The miracle is not that some of it was lost. The miracle is that so much of it remains. Read one of these transcripts carefully, and something happens. The language slows you down. These are not the clipped performative answers of people who know they're being recorded for posterity. They're not composing their legacy. They're talking the way people talk when they're old. And someone is finally sitting still long enough to listen. Digressions, corrections. The moment where someone says, "No, wait, that's not how it was," and then starts over. An elderly man in his 90s describing what he remembers about the years just after the war. Not the famous battles, not the generals, the price of corn, the quality of the road between two towns, or the name of a dog he had when he was 7. You sit with that detail, the dog's name, and realize it is the most honest thing in the document. Nobody invents a dog's name for posterity. Nobody performs grief over a dead animal from 80 years ago. That detail is real, in a way that official records almost never are. History is almost never what we think it is, when we're inside it. It is the price of corn, the dog's name, the road. What were these people carrying? Think about it without sentimentality. Just think about the volume of it. Born in the 1840s. The oldest of them would have been forming their earliest memories in the years before the Civil War. They would have watched that war unfold from childhood or young adulthood, lived through Reconstruction, watched it collapse, moved through the Gilded Age. They've seen the country industrialise at a pace that had no historical precedent, survived the economic panics of 1873 and 1893, possibly lost everything they owned, rebuilt, watched a new century arrive, watched the Great War, watched the flu of 1918 move through their towns, like something out of the Old Testament, and then, still alive, watched the Depression settle over everything, like weather that wouldn't break. Nearly 90 years of American history, not read, lived. And in the 1930s, a writer with a government paycheck knocked on the door and said, "Tell me what you remember." We should be honest about the limitations. Not every interview captured what the interviewer intended to capture. And not every subject felt free to speak openly, particularly among the formerly enslaved men and women being interviewed in the Deep South, often by white interviewers, in a political climate where the memory of Reconstruction's failure was not abstract. It was recent. It was personal. It was still dangerous in some places to speak certain things aloud. What people chose to say and what they chose not to say was shaped by all of that. The silence in these documents is as significant as the words. Some researchers argue that the most important thing the Federal Writers Project interviews reveal is not what was said, but what the conditions of saying it were. Who was in the room? Who held the pen? Whose version of the story got transcribed, and whose got softened, omitted, or simply misunderstood? There is a difference between a person speaking freely and a person speaking carefully. The transcripts don't always tell you which one you're reading. History does not record itself. It is recorded by people with their own positions, their own blind spots, their own reasons for writing what they wrote and leaving out what they left out. That is not cynicism. That is just the truth of how documentation works. By 1950, the last of the people born in the 1840s were, by definition, over 100 years old. A very small number, a handful, maybe, people of extraordinary longevity in most cases. The Federal Writers Project was finished. The New Deal was over. The country was already in the middle of a different kind of anxiety. The Cold War, the atomic age, and the sense that the old American story was giving way to something that didn't yet have a name. The interviews sat in boxes, some of them unread, for decades, some still inadequately indexed, inadequately digitized, waiting for a researcher who knows exactly what to look for. The Library of Congress has made significant portions of the collection available online. Digitization efforts continue, but the complete picture, every transcript, every handwritten note, every account set down before the pen ran dry or the interviewer moved on, that picture may never be fully assembled. Not because someone decided it wasn't worth preserving. Sometimes because no one decided anything at all. Neglect doesn't announce itself, it just accumulates, quietly, year by year. There is a question that hovers over all of this. Maybe not a conspiratorial question, a genuine one. How many of those conversations happened and left no record? How many people, born in 1843, in 1847, in 1839, were never interviewed? Lived in a county where the Writers' Project had no presence, or a neighbourhood the interviewers didn't visit, or a community that didn't trust the government enough to let a stranger with a notepad through the door? How much of what they knew ended when they did? That question doesn't have an answer. That's exactly the point. The archive shows us what was saved. It cannot show us what wasn't. The absence is invisible by definition. You cannot catalogue what was never collected, not lost through malice, lost through ordinary human limitation. That is almost harder to sit with. What remains is imperfect, human, real. A woman describing the sound of a train she rode as a child. A man explaining how a field looked before the drought changed it. Someone remembering a name, a neighbour, a relative, a friend who died before the century turned, speaking it aloud into a room in 1938, the last time that name would ever be spoken by anyone who had actually known the person it belonged to. That moment, the last time a name is said by someone who remembers the face, has no monument, no marker. It happens in ordinary rooms, in ordinary conversations, and then it's over. The Federal Writers Project caught some of those moments. Not all of them, not even most of them, but some. We live in an age that generates more documentation than any previous civilization. Every transaction recorded, every conversation potentially retrievable. On the assumption is that the future will have access to everything, that abundance has solved the problem of loss. But abundance creates its own kind of invisibility. The voices in those archives were nearly lost not because too little was written down, but because what was written down sat in boxes that nobody opened, in buildings that changed hands, in collections that were underfunded and understaffed, and simply not prioritised. The lesson of the Federal Writers Project is not that we need to collect more, it's that collection is not enough. Someone has to open the box. In a climate-controlled vault in Washington, D.C., sits a plain grey box. Inside isn't gold, it isn't state secrets, it's something far more fragile. It is the voice of a person born in the 1840s, talking in a room in 1938. He's saying the things they had carried for 90 years and never been asked to put into words until now. Talking about the price of corn, the name of a dog, the colour of the sky, on a night when everything burned, saying, in their own way, the only thing any of us ultimately want to say, I was here, I saw this, don't forget.